So I want to switch gears a little bit here as we're moving through our introduction, and I want to talk a little bit about some history that's important for gay men. And I'm going to just stick with the last century mainly for time. I certainly encourage you to do a more expansive look into such things like Greek and Roman history, how gay men have existed since, there were paintings on caves. I certainly would encourage you to look at cultures that have created places of acceptance and cultures that have created places of disdain, so that you can kind of get an idea of how this has impacted gay men over a longer continuum. So, but really important in the last century, I think one of the first places that I tend to start is in Nazi Germany. You'll see in the slide on history, you'll see a pink triangle present there. And most people at this point know, and may not, that pink triangle was actually the symbolism that was worn by gay men in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. There was a whole system of triangles, sometimes interlocking triangles, but specifically for gay men, this pink triangle was an identification of sexual orientation and had a lot of negative stigma attached to it in that scenario. And it's been once again reclaimed and re-empowered as a symbol of remembering and a symbol of strength. Another area to be mindful of is in the 1950s, men in the Kinsey reports. The Kinsey reports are pretty well known at this point. Around 1948 through 1953, we get some of the first evidence. We start looking at the population of how many gay men may be out there. We found numbers of 8 to 10%, at least in the Kinsey studies, where men were practicing exclusive homosexuality. Also in the 50s, in 1956, for us in psychology and in counseling and just in mental health in general, the work of Evelyn Hooker is actually extremely important. Evelyn Hooker basically provided research and substance to the notion that homosexuality was not an illness. In fact, much of her work, amongst others, led to its removal later on in the 70s, that homosexuality was removed from the DSM. Another important date for gay men is in 1969 and the 60s, which were the Stonewall riots in New York. This is one of the first times we begin to see a really public and strong message that there is this gay liberationist movement. There is this sense of rights being fought for, a sense of demanding an equality. This is certainly a good area to do a little bit of reading. Some of this is sort of caught up in urban legend, and certainly some of this is you can find some facts on the Stonewall riots. But in general, the bars had been raided in New York, and gay men and drag queens, and in the Stonewall riots there was a big movement for transgender persons, part of the trans community, where there was a fighting back against the police raiding the Stonewall bar, and basically beginning to have a voice and take back rights. 1970s, numerous changes that we begin to see. We see the first gay clergy beginning to emerge, openly gay clergy. National task force is created, Lambda Legal, legal services for the LGBT community. We actually see in 73 the removal of the diagnosis from the DSM. That's the diagnostic manual. We also see in 78 a major event occur, which is the assassination of Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone in San Francisco. There's a little bit of history around that, around something called the Twinkie defense, where Dan White, who was also a supervisor like Harvey Milk in San Francisco, basically used a defense that included biochemistry, too much sugar, not enough rest. It was a kind of a complex amalgamation of reasons why he committed the assassination, which actually lessened his sentence. He actually only served 2 years of what I believe was a 7-year sentence. However, he committed suicide shortly after that. Harvey Milk, in many ways, is the Martin Luther King Jr. for many gay men. I can tell you, before I moved to California, I didn't even know who Harvey Milk was. That information wasn't available. Certainly, I won't date myself, but it wasn't as readily available on the internet as it is now. And until I moved to California, that was sort of an eye-opener for me, and that wasn't that long ago. And so we'll also find that in some places, in certain regions, information that's important like this may not be as available and present. As we move forward in the 1990s, we begin to see a greater opening socially, where we begin to see gay men appear more in positive roles on TV, in the media, and in movies. We also have this sort of closing politically, where there's a lot of things that are going on in the 90s that actually wind up closing off equal rights and preventing the sense that a gay man can be considered equal in the dominant culture. And one of those is in 1993. We see Don't Ask, Don't Tell being signed in. In 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act, basically specifically noting that marriage is between a man and a woman being put into place. And we certainly see some court cases actually doing the opposite, such as the U.S. Supreme Court in 1996, working towards establishing that gay rights are not special rights, they're actually equal rights. And there's some protection beginning to build there. So it's kind of this continuum of a lot of things where rights are being closed off, whereas in other areas rights are being acknowledged and addressed. And so that moves us to the 2000s, up until a current date. And really, just in general, I'll say this. If you've been watching TV, you've been out in the public at all, you've certainly seen a much stronger push for equal rights for the LGBT community. Specifically, in my mindset here, for gay men, certainly been pushing for rights such as marriage, and that's certainly been one of the larger areas where the push for equal rights has occurred. Also, in dealing with identifying crimes against the LGBT community as hate crimes, and we certainly saw the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell very recently, so that gay men and their counterparts in the LGBT community can actively serve in the military. So one of the things, though, I want to go back a little bit in the history here, because I want to talk a little bit about something that's very important about gay male history, and that's the gender roles and how they've changed over the last century. In your reference list, you'll see a book that was written by Levine. He also did some research on this work that was translated into a book, and it really talked about something called the clone culture, which really gives us a great sort of model up until about the 80s of what was going on with gay men. And what's discussed there is that basically prior to the 1960s, gay men lived this sort of dichotomous life. Sodomy laws and the thought that homosexuals are pedophiles and communists, that was certainly present in the community. And like there's this connection between being homosexual, being a gay male, is connected with being sick, connected to illness. And so many men had to live their lives in secret. And so what you found was many men would live a masculine life, whatever that meant culturally, as the dominant culture defined masculinity. And then in the gay bars, the underground sort of hidden areas, you would find often gay men really experimenting with gender expression. Often much of the drag queen community was sort of born of that expression. Some of the trans community may have even been born from some of that expression in the sense of having a place to actually exist and be with one's true sense of gender. And this sort of transition occurs from the 60s to the 70s, where as the liberationist movements, as the Stonewall riots occur, and really some of the liberationist movement we can date back to 1950s starting, but as that builds, because we know that a lot of the women's liberationist movements Certainly the liberationist movements for lesbians were well on its way. African American, Black American liberationist movements were well on their way. Gay men sort of joined that liberationist movement. And what we find is sort of this pendulum effect, where the community goes from hiding to this overt expression, this sort of sense of not just am I here, but I'm going to be out and I'm going to be proud. And to some degree, there may even be sort of this movement to in your face. I mean, we get groups like the Village People that occur around this time that certainly represent what Levine and what the community called the clone culture. And this represented, once again, sort of a hyper-masculine and hegemonic gay man. And there were masculine drag that was often associated with that. At that time, masculine and feminine really, once again, had this fluidity in the community. And so you may dress in a very masculine way, but then may even still express yourself in a very feminine way, and that's accepted and okay. And so there are these sort of coming out and this creation of a community, of a gay male community, where there's a sense of pride in the community and almost a sense of separating from the dominant culture. In fact, you begin to find gay communities being built and being created, sometimes in what they called the gay ghettos, where impoverished areas were built up by gay men and by other members of the LGBT community, but specifically we're talking about gay men here. And what that leads to is you see this culture that has this mass expression. There's also sort of these sort of cutting off of certain people who don't fit into certain stereotypes that are appreciated or identified within the clone culture. You had to sort of fit a new system of rules to be a part of the gay male community. Well, what happens in the 80s, as we know, is that HIV and AIDS, there's this epidemic. And in many ways it has this massively devastating impact on the gay male community. Part of that being that the ease of transmission between gay men is really at the highest in any sort of coupling and any sort of sexual pairing. And so what you get is a lot of loss and a lot of death and also a lot of fear. And now there's research coming out and discussion and dialogue about where did this bear community come from that I mentioned earlier? Where did this sort of movement towards a more young, youthful, healthy, and sometimes more effeminate gay male youth group, sort of this diversion of these two groups, where did they come from? And there's some speculation that to look healthy at the time when there was a crisis of the AIDS epidemic, the more healthy you looked, the more there was sort of this social valuing and this sort of safety that occurred. So larger men, the bears, they tended to be larger, almost with sort of this assumption of being healthy. Young gay men who are muscular, not overtly thin, but evidence sort of a healthy self, once again, becomes sort of a safe group. So there's some speculation about that there was this sort of creation that sort of was born out of the clone community splitting as a reaction. Certainly a lot of the resources that were available to gay men as far as engaging with other gay men, the bars, bathhouses, a lot of the sexual freedom suddenly becomes repressed again out of a need for safety. What this also leads to is sort of a backlash in the community in the 80s as well. People become very afraid of gay men, and AIDS was, of course, we look back in history, was associated as a gay male disease. And there's a lot of finger pointing and there's a lot of religious dialogue about that this was caused and created by gay men or as a result of allowing gay men to exist. What we see kind of born out of that comes up to our culture now as far as gender and gender expression is there can be a lot of negative energy about meeting certain body image ideals, and that can be in the bear community, and that certainly can be in the community that idolizes youth and thinness and muscularness. There can be a lot of image ideals that people can't meet into, that the average person may not be able to be a part of, and it creates new norms that can really exclude people, and it creates exclusionary practices. Having said that, once again, the LGBT community often comes together, holds its own, and brings a lot of containment, safety, and community for its people. But these are some of the dynamics that still occur internally, even in a system that creates such community. What we also begin to see, and this could be some of that internalized homophobia, is sexism between gay men and lesbians that have come out, where certainly it's not unheard of, especially in early identity development for gay men, where there may be this distancing from women, and especially lesbians, which are sort of the polarized end of women being women who love women. And so you may see this sort of movement sometimes away from gay men, away from lesbians, lesbians away from gay men. And really it's not until we move to a place of beginning to accept and integrate bigger dynamics that you lose some of that.